because we do upload them on the. Okay, Rebecca, probably because the event is just literally starting, Rebecca. So you can try now because it literally starts at 4:30. Rebecca in the chat. Well, anyway, so let's go ahead and start. It's already 4:30. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nayeli Lopez. If you haven't met me by now, I'm the director of the Soul Office here. We have a great event for y'all today. We're going to be celebrating and honoring and keeping in mind Asian Pacific Islander Desi American Heritage Month here in TAMU. I know it's right before finals, so I know that y'all are going to be busy soon, studying, all that good stuff. I want to thank you for being here with us today. And we have great speakers going on for today. And so I encourage everybody to engage in conversation, ask questions as much as possible so you can gain the knowledge and just really learn about, different identities and different cultures, right? So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen with y'all. Sorry, I was on mute. So Social Justice Leadership Series, I think a lot of you have attended our programs before, but if you haven't, a little bit about our Social Justice Leadership Series. Some of the things that we value is service, respect, growth, power, privilege, oppression, identities. And so we talk a lot about different topics within our series. And so we ultimately want to make sure that we are respecting each other. Nationally, we've seen institutions have had a rise of reports of discrimination and student protests where they feel their voices are not being heard. And so nationally, a lot of institutions face social justice issues and inequities. And so that's one of the main reasons why we have this program at TAMU. We want to continue living up to our TAMU's mission, want to continue to provide resources for faculty, staff, and students in order for us to continue to be inclusive in our community. So that's a little bit about the Social Justice Leadership Series here. Ambassadors, a lot of you are interested in becoming Social Justice Leadership Series ambassadors. And so this program shows that you must attend 6 out of the 12 programs we've had so far. And so I think most of you have attended. So this would be a requirement for you. So we are looking for Social Justice Leadership Series ambassadors for the fall semester. So if this is of interest to you, we will be sending the applications within the next couple of weeks. Social justice and social justice here. So we have some terms here that we define in all our programs. So social justice, we define it as the inclusion of everyone, the full benefits of society, and the empowerment of people to participate fully in the economic, social, and cultural life of the country. So as we go on in today's conversation and presentation, I want you to think about how social justice takes a role in the Asian Pacific Islander Desi American heritage. Power. The way we define power here is institutional power, the ability or official authority to decide what is best for others, right? So it's deciding who will have access, that's the key word, access to resources, the capacity to exercise control over others. So I want you to think about how power takes a role in the Asian Pacific Islander Desi American heritage. Privilege. As we know, privilege has a variety of components when it comes to privilege. The way we define it in the program is unearned access to resources only readily available to some people as a result of their advantaged social group membership. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of you have seen this definition before, so this should be a review for most of you. But if you haven't, this probably will be the first time that you're exposed to these definitions through our program. Oppression that we'll be defining here is a system that maintains advantage and disadvantage based on social group membership and operates either intentionally and or unintentionally, either on an individual, institutional, cultural levels. So oppression, thinking about the Asian Pacific Islander group and how oppression, especially I mean, it's been going on for many years, but especially recently with the hate for Asian Americans, et cetera, on how the United States has oppressed a lot of different identity groups. So I want you to think about that in today's presentation. So we're going to go ahead and start with our first speaker, which is Dr. DeMello. Let's go ahead and give a virtual applause and welcome to Dr. DeMello.
Thanks, everyone. Here, let me just share my screen. Perfect. Can you see it? Okay. Yeah, cool. Okay, so hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I know you're all really busy prepping for finals and those last minute papers and things like that. My talk today is going to focus on what we're going to call hate as a virus. And we're going to just look at some of the manifestations of discrimination against Asians, Pacific Islanders here in the United States. I'm hoping to keep this a little bit on the shorter side because I'm really excited to hear more about your conversations, either from me or some of the other speakers. And that being said, even though there's a lot of different manifestations, we're going to focus on two case studies. So one is A Queen with No Throne. I'm looking at Hawaii. And then we're going to talk a little bit about Japanese displacement during World War II. And we'll end with just a brief conversation about sort of contextualizing this, like Nayeli said, here in the more recent events that we've seen around our country. So for both of our case studies, I'm going to keep it a little bit higher level, not really going into like the details too much. But if you have further questions, if you'd like more information, feel free to ask in the Q&A. I could send you articles, and I've tried to include some references in there as well, sorry. So just a little bit about me. I think for these types of conversations, it's important that we're all sort of just on the same page and really creating this like equal and like inviting space. And so a little bit about me. I was born and raised in Southern California. And so I actually experienced ethnicity and ethnic violence at a very young age. So in the K-12 system, we had a really high level of gang activity in my neighborhood. So I really saw a lot of like Hispanic versus African-American gangs just playing out like in front of me on the schoolyard. But then also, I think like many of you, I grew up right in that post 9/11 age where sadly, a lot of people mistook me as an Asian Indian for Middle Eastern. And so there was a lot of discrimination in the sense of, you know, you look a certain way, therefore you must be a bad person. And so that's just a little bit where I come from. My PhD is in criminal justice and criminology. And just sort of looking at the names, I see some familiar ones from my classes. So hi, and if you haven't taken my classes, please feel free. I would love to have you. My background is focusing on gangs and terrorist organizations, but diversity, equity, and inclusion is something I'm really passionate about. And I try and incorporate that into every study that I work on. Excuse me. In terms of like diversity, I'm also a first generation college student and a minority. And so I'm not focusing on this so much today, but I'm actually ethnically Indian, but my parents are from Pakistan. So I also sort of have another dimension of anti-Asian discrimination, where it's Asian on Asian discrimination of Pakistan and India's conflict, which I'd love to talk to you a little bit about during the conversation if it comes up. So for our first case study, I call this A Queen with No Throne. And for this, we're really talking about the Hawaiian Islands. And so oftentimes when we think of Hawaii, we think of this really beautiful landscape, right? So this picture on the bottom left of those like green mountains and that like see-through waters. And oftentimes we don't really think about the politics of it. And I think that's because for so long, we've all sort of just accepted that Hawaii is a part of the United States. But you might be surprised to know that it was actually an independent kingdom for a very long time as a true monarchy. So the earliest Hawaiians actually arrived in the archipelago in anywhere between the 300 to 700 BC timeframe. So we're talking well over 2,000 years ago that they've been in the islands. And they traveled from other parts of Polynesia on canoes that look very similar to this one here in the top left. Note this one has the American flag. It is a more modern canoe. But with them, they brought everything that they needed to survive. So they brought pigs, dogs, chickens, sweet potatoes, taro, coconut, and sugarcane. So we could see here, this is sugarcane. So this is one of the sugarcane plantations on Kauai. And then this is taro, which is a type of root vegetable that Hawaii has become famous for. And so it's interesting to think about these dynamics, right? Because these manifestations like the sugarcane plantations, which ended up becoming symbols of repression, really were a part of the Polynesian identity from the very beginning. So not necessarily part of the story, but I think a really interesting anecdote. So this canoe in the top left is called the Hokulea. And so it's actually a full-scale canoe that Native Hawaiians still sail today. And so they actually sail all over the world with this canoe with the intention of bringing awareness for Native Hawaiians and Indigenous peoples. And they sail all over the world, to Europe, to Asia, and back to Hawaii. I think as we're talking about this, it's important to think about, ways that these Indigenous peoples can continue to ensure that their heritage and their culture survive and really flourish, especially in the age of sort of like mingling and just like dispersion. So in terms of the social structure of Hawaii, a lot of times people say like, oh, they're just tribes. So like how structured is it? And it is actually quite hierarchical. So at the very top, ancient Hawaii had the kings. And each island at first had their own monarch. So like Oahu had one, Kauai, Maui, the Big Island. And eventually those actually consolidated into one kingdom. On each island, there were the different chiefs of the villages known as the ali'i. And after them are the kahuna. So those are like the craftsmen or your skilled workers. Underneath them are the maka'aina or the commoners. And so these are really like the majority of the people, right? So if you think of like the constituents of the king. But what a lot of people don't know is Hawaii actually had a slave or untouchable caste as well called the kauva. And so those are very much in the traditional sense like your slave caste. And they were often forced to work onto the plantations and things of that nature. And so if you're thinking about this from a contextual perspective, this image here on the right is actually the hierarchy of medieval Europe. And so you'll see it's very similar, this idea of you have the royals and then the lords, the common folk, and then the lower caste. So I think it's important to know, even when we're thinking back like 2000 years, this hierarchy is there and there is this sophistication, because oftentimes people will say, well, the Europeans modernized Hawaii and we saved them and brought them into the new world. And it's really not the case. So socially, those structures were in place well before they ever came into contact with Europe. So European discovery really happened in around January of 1778 by Captain James Cook. I'm sure you've heard stories of him in some of your history courses in K-12 or here at TAMU. And Captain Cook, he was known for his discoveries and really expanding Europe's worldview. And so he, quote unquote, discovers the islands accidentally, but while searching for a route from Alaska to Asia directly, he ends up in Hawaii. And first, the Hawaiian people actually welcomed him, and so they called his people the Ha'ole. And so in today's world, Ha'ole really means white people or non-Hawaiians. And so in today's society, sometimes that's taken as more of a negative term. But back then they literally meant you who has no pigment in your skin, which I thought was fascinating, right? Because it was just such a pure word at the time. And so they welcomed him and his people to the Hawaiian Islands. And unfortunately, like with a lot of Native American stories, that just doesn't end well for the indigenous populations. They were treated very poorly. Ultimately, he was told, you and your men need to leave these islands and never come back. So they sailed off and they ended up having some damage to the ships. So they needed to return to Hawaii. And upon being returned, the Native Hawaiians were so furious that a mob actually destroyed the ships and ended up killing Captain Cook. And so this is a little bit of a weird anecdote, but people really know Captain Cook's death because a lot of people actually claim that the Hawaiians consumed his body in cannibalism, and that's not true. That is a myth. What they did is they did actually boil the bones, though, because in the Polynesian culture, your bones are where like your life forces and that power comes from. And so they believe by boiling his bones, we can absorb that power and help our people. But they did not eat the meat despite some popular beliefs. So this is Kamehameha the Great. So he's one of the kings. And so he had his vision of, I want one unified Hawaii. I don't want to have all of these different kingdoms. I want it to be united. So taking his training that he learned from Captain Cook, he started a conquest of the different islands. So first he conquered Big Island, then Maui, Molokai, Lanai. And finally, he said, okay, Oahu is much bigger. There's a lot more tribes. So it took a lot more resources, but he was able to succeed. And from there, he said, okay, I'm going to make one unified Hawaii. And so this is the first time that those 8 Hawaiian islands that we have come to know and love from that beautiful image and that map really became one kingdom, and they swore their allegiance to Great Britain and its queen. But around that time, in the 1820s, that's when we started to see American farmers starting to move from the mainland, so the continental US, off to the Hawaiian Islands to begin farming and plantations. And everything seemed fine at first. It seemed to be a very synergistic system of everyone helping each other out. But we started to see a little bit of discontent. And I think it's important to note that there were 5 Kamehamehas, and with each Kamehameha, they seem to see a little bit more tension than their predecessor. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit to Kamehameha IV. And it was actually during his reign that a lot of these foreigners, specifically the Americans, really started to make this push of, why are you your own kingdom? Why you're just a small little island in the middle of nowhere? The United States is big, it's powerful. Those common themes that the United States has done in the past for colonization. And they said, look, we're the sugar cane plantation owners. We're the ones who are providing all of the jobs. We're running the economy. We want to be a part of the United States because there's better trade deals, which makes more money for us. So now, of course, that caused a lot of discontent with the Native Hawaiians, right? Because they've spent thousands of years at this point as their own people, their own governance system. And it was a huge struggle. And ultimately, the royal family said, we're not having that. We're not interested. We are our own culture and our own kingdom. So under Kamehameha V, the last of the Kamehamehas, that's when we started to see a lot of problems, because during his reign, that was during the Civil War. And so what we saw is that the Civil War created problems where the northern states no longer had access to their sugar from the southern states. And so that's where this really became the highlight of the importance of Hawaii, right? Because Hawaii wasn't part of this like north-south because it wasn't a state at the time. So a lot of Americans said, this is the way that we bypass the system. We can get sugar to the north by just taking it from Hawaii. And that's where we start to see a lot of the problems, right? Of where were they paid fairly? Were Native Hawaiians treated appropriately in the process? Was it a treaty that benefited all? This is a little bit of that theme that Nayeli mentioned about like power and power differentials and like differences in power. Around this time, a bunch of Americans and even some Hawaiians actually created a Hawaiian legislature. So if you think of like England, like where they created like parliament, something very similar where they were trying to limit the power of the monarchy. And what happened was they thought that this was for the best interest of Hawaii, but it ended up being something that was really driven racially. So a lot of the Native Hawaiians ended up being disenfranchised or pushed out. And this legislature was really controlled by the very wealthy white Americans who held a lot of land in Hawaii. And so then we also had a new level of conflict where these Americans said, I'm American, I'm speaking English. And so they refused to speak Olelo Hawaii or the Hawaiian language in the legislature. And Hawaiians refused to speak English, which caused a lot of discontent. And you can actually see that in today's world as well. So the legislature in Hawaii today, as a state of the United States, actually has two official working languages, English and Hawaiian. And so some of the indigenous people will only speak on the floor in Hawaiian, and they'll have translations into English to show that connection to their cultural heritage. And a lot of people say it really is in defiance of the American system because of this sort of like pseudo legislature that was created way back when. But ultimately, Kamehameha V was the last king of Hawaii who wasn't elected by the people. After that, it was no longer a constrained system. So we're going to fast forward a little bit again to Queen Liliuokalani. And I think that her story is so inspirational, but also so sad. So she was the last of the monarchs, excuse me, and really her reign was filled with just the struggles of fighting to keep the peace between these businessmen and the native Hawaiian politicians and people just of her constituency. Her goal was to give the monarchy back its power, so that she understood that, you know, the native Hawaiians were duped and that they were wrongfully taken the power away from, to give it more to a pro-American stance. And ultimately, in trying to get back her power, the white businessmen came together and they formed a militia of about 1,500 soldiers. And they said, we're creating the Committee of Safety. It's a new government. The queen is overthrown. Deal with it. And so this put her in a very awkward position, right? Because as a monarch, her reign was being threatened. And so she made a very important decision where she said, you know, I could have you arrested for treason, but I want peace. I don't want my subjects to be killed in needless bloodshed because I know they will fight for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you take over this government building. I'm going to let you bring in the US Marines, and I'm going to relinquish power. But on the left here is the statement that she gave. And if you notice, where is it? So if you notice right here where it says, until such time as the government of the United States shall, upon the facts being presented to it, undo the action of its representative and reinstate me in the authority which I claim as the constitutional sovereign of the Hawaiian Islands. So this is a really powerful sentence, and a lot of people don't really understand the significance of this sentence from a political context. So what she's saying here is, yes, I'm giving the United States president the power over the islands, but it's not a unlimited forever gives, right? We're in a state of crisis, so I'm trusting you as a caretaker to protect these lands until you can restore order and give it back to me and my heirs. And I think that's really important because some of the Native Hawaiians have actually tried to sue the United States in international court, saying like, we are not part of Hawaii, we're not part of the United States, excuse me. There is this own kingdom that should still be in existence, and that the annexation was illegal. And something that's a little weird though is with the international court system, all parties need to agree to be a member of the court. And so the United States just has not recognized that claim. But if you look back, and it ebbs and flows over time, at some period, there were several very prominent European countries actually sided with the Hawaiians and signed on to their claim of, yes, you know, the United States claim is illegal. So I think it's a very interesting dynamic. And so, of course, some Native Hawaiians did try to revolt, but that failed. And ultimately, the queen was arrested and she was imprisoned in the bedroom in Iolani Palace. If you ever visit Honolulu, you can go to the palace today. It's the only royal residence in the United States. And you can see the room that she was kept in, and it's very, very small. To put this into perspective, most of our classrooms, for example, at TAMU were like way bigger than the room that she was confined in to spend her entire days. And now if you go, the center of the room actually has a quilt, and that was a quilt that she made that tells Hawaii's story. And so there's this book right here called Hawaii's Story by Hawaii's Queen. And so this is where somebody actually took her stories and put it into words and wrote it down. It's an amazing, amazing book, and I believe it's available in our TAMU library. I highly recommend reading it if you're interested in sort of hearing the full story of Hawaii and sort of how Hawaii ended up moving from monarchy to the United States. So if we fast forward to today's world, oftentimes a lot of people will say, yeah, that happened a long time ago, but why does that matter now? Like they're already a part of the United States. They've been part of the United States. Why does it matter? And so if we look at these graphics, what we see is Native Hawaiians suffer from a health perspective more than other populations. So Native Hawaiians were at increased risk, along with American Indians, of severe illness pertaining to like coronavirus comorbidities. This bottom graphic here is from JABSUM, which is the med school at the University of Hawaii. And they found that Native Hawaiians were susceptible to heart disease, cancer, stroke, all sorts of diseases at far higher rates than non-Native comparison groups. And so I think that it's really important to think of this, right? Because when we think of like social justice, a lot of times we'll think about the politics or the criminal justice. For example, like the talks on social media lately have really focused on like justice within police for specific like minorities. But we need to think about the ripple effects of how does criminal justice or politics impact health, well-being, the economy, and everything, even the art and cultural connections that we have. So the next case study I want to talk about is a little bit shorter, but it's the displacement of Japanese Americans or Japanese nationals in the United States. And so this really centers around Pearl Harbor, right? So World War II is happening. The United States, until this point, has said, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to deal with it. Like Europe have your crisis, Asia have your crisis, keep us out of it. And all of that changed when Pearl Harbor was attacked, because at that point they had attacked our national security interests and we could no longer fight back. What a lot of people don't realize, though, is when they think of Pearl Harbor, they think of the destruction of the USS Arizona and the Arizona Memorial. But several strategic locations on Oahu were attacked at that time, including Air Force bases, Army centers, and the Navy. So the Japanese attack was very strategic and very well planned, which is actually what led to such a significant response from the United States. So the attack of Pearl Harbor resulted in what we call Executive Order 9066. And so in this executive order, President Roosevelt, in essence, told the United States Army, you can create these spaces in the United States in which you're excluding any and all persons. So immediately, this causes all sorts of concerns about the legality, right? Of, can you just kick someone off of property? What about the property they own? If it's any or all persons, what defines any versus all? How can we break it down? Are they specific groups? Do they have to commit a crime? There was a lot of uncertainty, which caused a lot of conflict within the court system, but it was a lot of chaos, right? Because things are happening very fast because they're responses to Pearl Harbor. We need to respond. So it was a very messy situation. So while it was playing out, this quote unquote relocation begins. And so this was actually targeted towards individuals of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast. So think California, Oregon, Washington State. And so in total, it ended up affecting roughly 120,000 people. So we're talking a pretty significant population, right? And a lot of times people will say, well, those were Japanese nationals here in this country. Some of the themes are they were here illegally, et cetera, et cetera. But that's actually not true. About 2/3 of them were US citizens. Some of them were born and raised in the United States and never even been to Japan. And then thinking back to our other case study of Hawaii, about 1/3 of Hawaii's population are actually of Japanese descent. And so that created an entirely different problem, right? If you have so much of a population, how do you deal with that? So they didn't actually create internment camps in Hawaii. Instead, the federal government put the entire islands under martial law. So it didn't even matter what your ethnic background was, you were subject to those martial law rules. So some facts and figures, if you look at this map, all of the red dots are where there was an internment camp for Japanese Americans. And what you can see is it actually spreads across a decent amount of this country, right? Because if we're thinking of the West Coast down here, like forcibly relocating from the West Coast all the way to Arkansas is well over halfway across the country. So we saw massive shifts across the United States. But also, the actual support of the population for this was quite high. So along the west, there were more concerns of, if Japan could strike Hawaii, maybe they could strike us too. So it makes a little bit more sense that we saw strong support for internment. But there are other states, such as like the Midwest, right, where we tend to have less diversity, higher levels of white populations, higher levels of conservative politics, where they also had strong support of internment, which a lot of people have argued really is just proof that this is like racism, not so much a political response to a national security need. So in terms of like, how did this wind down? Really, it was the Supreme Court that took action. So on December 18th, they released two key decisions. So the first was Korematsu v. United States, which was actually a split decision of 6-3. And in that case, the justices actually ruled that an individual who appealed their sentence did have their conviction upheld for violating this exclusion order. And they said, the United States military is allowed to remove Japanese Americans from the West Coast for a national security purpose. So they said it is constitutional to remove them. But this ex parte endo was a unanimous decision in which they said, however, if you have someone who's a declared loyal citizen of the United States, so think of those populations who were born here or even people who immigrated, who swore their allegiance to this country upon immigration, regardless of their cultural descent, their political beliefs, anything like that, you cannot detain them without cause because that comes under our Bill of Rights. And so it was very interesting because the bottom line that the Supreme Court said is you can remove them from your land, but you cannot incarcerate them. And so that caused a lot of controversy. And I think something that was very sneaky, in my opinion, is the president was actually told of this decision the day before. So notice the date, December 17th, 1944. And so he said, okay, this is coming tomorrow. The Supreme Court is going to, in essence, say that I'm wrong. So I need to get out ahead of this and make myself look like the hero, right? And so what he did is the day before the court released their decision, Roosevelt issued public proclamation number 21, in which he said, we're rescinding these exclusion orders. Japanese Americans, you're welcome back on the West Coast. Please return effective next month. But when the Supreme Court still issued the decisions the next day, it sort of became one of those like, ooh, I was busted, right? Like clearly I knew, like people it was very obvious to people that I knew that it was coming and I was just trying to revert my decision. But it did mean an end to the internments. However, the aftermath was very messy. So in 1976, President George Ford issued a proclamation in which he apologized to Japanese Americans. But people said that's not enough. You can't just make an apology decades later and assume that that's going to be okay. And so there was a lot of pressure on Congress, on the presidency, and even the court systems to create some sort of action or some sort of equity that will help remedy these situations. So in 1988, Congress actually passed the Civil Liberties Act, in which they officially apologized on behalf of the country for the grave injustice done to persons of Japanese ancestry. And I think this is quite significant because within that legislation, they actually declared that the internment was motivated largely by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. So they really put the blame on politics. They said, partisanship came into play, and political parties fighting with each other failed the United States and populations. But they also admitted that there was racism. And I think that that's important because a lot of times the systemic racism within the United States is a little bit hidden within the political system. And so it's very, not nice, but I guess it's very refreshing in a way that Congress admitted that this is a problem that we need to resolve. But it created more issues as well, right? Because President Reagan then said, we're going to authorize $20,000 payments to anyone who had suffered this injustice. And so that created a new can of worms of, okay, that's wonderful, but what about slavery and reparations for slavery? I wrote repatriations, but that's reparations. And so that is still a battle that's fought today. And ultimately in 1999, President Bush also sent a letter to all interned Japanese Americans to apologize. And so this is Joy Kogawa, and she is a survivor of internment. And I'm just going to give you a second to read this passage. I think it's really a powerful statement. So I'll just give you just a second. So for me, something that really stands out about this is you think of very like similarities to Germany during World War II, right? So like the Nazis removing Jews from their homes. Reading this passage, I think back to like when I read in high school The Diary of Anne Frank and some of those narratives as well. And so oftentimes a lot of people will actually say, you know, there is this comparison of Japanese internment in the United States to the concentration camps in Europe. And really what we've found, because, you know, history always reveals the truth, is that this racism was the driving force. And while like some of these images show like anti-Japanese sentiment, it's important to note that the internment and really these exclusion orders were actually a little bit broader. So other groups that were excluded from certain areas included the Germans and the Italians. And I think a part of that is the reason why the Supreme Court did say that it was constitutional to remove, because it became more of a national security, like political belief perspective, as opposed to just one ethnic group. So all of these events that have happened across the United States have really led up to our current position, which I think everyone is very familiar with. And it comes down to sort of the narratives and the false narratives perpetrated by our former president, President Trump. And so here are just some snippets I found online, 3 of them from the president, or headlines from the president. And I think it's really important, right? Because information is power and information has meaning. And so when we see like our leadership saying things like this Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus, it causes a lot of emotions to stir, especially when they have a loyal following. And so their followers are more likely to believe like, yes, this is an Asian virus, when even science is saying, no, it's not, like, that's not how this works. This isn't a thing. People get so involved with the politics. And I think that this is really important if we think about misinformation versus disinformation. So misinformation is where the information is just not factually correct, right? So if I go and I tweet, you know, we had this wonderful workshop and I was so excited to end my talk, and I looked up and the sky was hot pink. That would be misinformation because the sky is not actually hot pink. Disinformation is where you intentionally infuse false narratives with the purpose of causing some sort of agenda. So if I was trying to, you know, cause some conspiracy and get rid of the color blue or something, and then that could be a campaign of disinformation. That was a terrible example, but that's literally what just came in the top of my head. But there's a lot of concern that the president and his supporters were engaging in a disinformation campaign where they were actively trying to create resentment and hostility towards minorities within the United States. Now, I think that history will really be the judge of if this is misinformation or disinformation. So my goal isn't to get into that or to create some sort of like, you know, political debate. But I think that this is an important example for us to think about, especially like at the university and as we go out into our communities, of what is the meaning of our words and how can we, like, why should we use very specific words to convey very concise and accurate points? Some information here. So if we look at this like graphic that's sort of in like the gray, this is how people actually worry about hate crimes in the COVID-19 times. And so Asian Indians actually are the highest group of the highest racial group that really fear that they're often going to be experiencing hate crimes. And a part of this actually isn't related to COVID at all. It's related to 9/11, because after September 11, a lot of people said, you know, well, Asian Indians look like Middle Easterners, and Middle Easterners are obviously tied to Al Qaeda. Therefore, all of you are terrorists. Terrible logic, so not true. But I think there's created this very like uncertainty and very like concern and anxiety within Asian Indians, especially in the United States over the last like 20 years or so. So that's pretty understandable that we see that high spike. But you'll notice that along all of the different Asian American categories, we see a pretty decent level of concern and fear, which I think is well founded because this graphic on the left shows just for some cities changes in changes in hate crimes against Asian Americans. And what we can see is even these like very progressive cities, right? Like New York and Boston, where we see like they're just sort of the flagships of progress and like, you know, New York City's home of pride and Boston and like the Tea Party and overthrowing the British. Even these places saw significant impact. So like in New York, for example, there was an 800% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes just in 1 year. So we're seeing really shocking times. So I don't want to leave you on this like doom and gloom. So I do want to end with the fact that there is a brighter tomorrow, right? Because in November 2020, Kamala Harris became our vice president. Well, she was elected vice president. She was installed, of course, in January. And if any of you have seen my Dust Devil like diversity spotlight piece, I talk about her a lot because Kamala really is, you know, an inspiration for a lot of people, including myself. You know, she's the first Asian American to hold the office of vice president and to be in that senior White House position. But even like she was very instrumental in her political capacities in California, and even like some of the things she did in the Senate really did bring a lot of awareness for Asian Americans here in the United States. And so ultimately, I task all of you with this challenge of think about what it is you want from this world. What are the things that you want to see? And so go out and be that change and help accomplish it. And together, we can really show the world that hate has no home here in TMU, in Laredo, Texas, or anywhere in the world. So thank you so much. The QR code just takes you to my website. So there's a little bit more about me, but I'm really excited to hear from the other presenters and to talk with all of you after. So thank you. How do I stop sharing? Oh, wait. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Alrighty, up next we have Ms. Larissa Cortez, who's going to be presenting to y'all here. Ms. Lori, do you have access or do I need to give you host access?
No, I have access. I'll go ahead and share. Sorry, I didn't know if you were going to introduce me, if I should just jump in. So I'll go ahead and share right now. Okay. Are we seeing that okay? Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. My name is Larissa Cortez. I go by Lori, so if you all see me around or meet me one time, Lori is fine. That's what I go by. And I am the Director of Equal Opportunity and Diversity and the Title IX Coordinator here at TAMU. And so I'm very excited to be here to talk to you about what our office does. And thank you so much, Dr. Demella. I miss being in school after watching that, but you don't give me a paper or a test, so it's much better. So thanks so much. So I want to talk a little bit more about with the rise of these incidents happening, we want to remind everybody, or maybe you all didn't know, and educate you about the space on campus where you can report this information. We recognize that these things do happen on our campus, and we want to ensure that you are aware where to report this information, what type of information you should be reporting, and the types of support services that we offer. So feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat box, and we will answer them at the end. So diving in a little bit and giving you a little bit of an overview of what we do here in our office. So ultimately, the university is committed to ensuring a discrimination-free environment where all people are treated fairly and with respect, regardless of their protected status. So regardless of their race, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, we want everyone to experience the TAMU experience free of that discrimination. We really serve to promote an open and inclusive environment. We aim to really create programs which promote the diversity and the awareness and ensures that the university complies with policies and laws. But ultimately, again, we want to encourage that free exchange of ideas and continue to attract people who want to have that diverse dialogue and bring in people from all over the world, because it is an international university. One of the things that we also do in this office is monitor and track diversity efforts to assess their effectiveness and ensure such efforts are in line with our mission and values. So ultimately, we want to make sure that the events that we are coming up with are related to what's going on in the real world, kind of like we're doing here today. And we also receive and investigate complaints of discrimination in this office. So we do take in reports on anybody who's experienced harassment or discrimination. It's important that the institution respond. And if somebody is found responsible for that behavior, it's really important that they receive the proper repercussions, because then we just encourage people to continue acting that way. And there's no message to them that that behavior is unwelcome. So how can we help you? So we can help faculty, staff, and students experiencing any form of discrimination or harassment on the basis of the protected classes, which include race, color, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, which we're seeing a lot more now, pregnancy, religion, disability, veteran status, and national origin, kind of touching on what we're talking about here today. And it also includes sex-based discrimination, which is your sexual misconduct, the dating and domestic violence, and the stalking. So here in this office, maybe some of you don't know, but we do take in those reports and we conduct investigations to assess if our policy was violated. And we also do have our own definition of discrimination. When we're investigating, we refer back to that definition. So it's important, again, that we do have that established protocol and process to be able to handle when we receive such reports. So what other options are available? So I talked about investigation, and perhaps, that's not for you. You want to look at other ways to resolve problems. And we understand that, and we understand that that road's not for everybody. So we do want to provide other options for people. So our office does much more than just conduct formal complaints and investigations. So we have a variety of other ways to address concerns, and they can include an informal resolution. That can look different, and it looks different depending on what you want to see, but that is an option. That's a newer component of the process. We also can do support measures. Sometimes people are not interested in the investigation aspect, but they want to be able to receive support and be able to be made whole again from what they experienced. And so that can be different for everybody. Everyone may need their own support, and so that can include securing a workplace space, housing, academic modifications, obtaining no contact orders between you and the other party involved, even talking to someone about their behavior and its effect on you. And we can look at other things as well. It's really an interactive process, so we want to know what we can do to help you. And another important component of this is education and training. We can train your group or class or organization about responsible employees and their roles, relevant laws and TAMIU policies and reporting options. And another big thing that we do is bystander intervention, which I'll go over a little bit more, but that's really a critical component when it comes to combating these types of incidents. Okay, so where can you report if you experience anti-Asian harassment or any type of other discrimination? So we really take reports in any way you want to give them to us. We have email, phone. We also have our electronic reporting site. And the unique thing with that reporting site is that you can report anonymously. Perhaps if you don't want to provide any personal information, that's fine. You can report there. There is a space where you can put your name, but that is optional. And so we want to make it known that we do have that option for you. Another thing to touch on is we understand that, after the incident happens, but if something's an emergency, it's really important. If there's any threat to personal safety or property, if someone has been injured, it's important that you call the police immediately. From any campus phone, you can call 911, and from, of course, obviously your cell phone, you can call 911. If there is an emergency, we're not the police, and we don't take the part of that. So if there is something, you should call police immediately. And then touching on retaliation, we take retaliation very seriously here on campus. It really deters people from reporting in the future and engaging in our process. So if we are ever made aware that anybody is experiencing retaliation, we want to know about it so we can cease that behavior from happening. Because again, it does have that chill factor, and we want to continue having people reporting to us. So we do take that very seriously. Okay. I also like to kind of unveil the mystery sometimes. I feel like people don't know what happens in our office. I think it's important that you know, okay, if I make a report, what's going to happen? So reporting simply means letting us know that something has happened. It can sound very formal, but all it means is making us aware of a situation. I will contact you to schedule a time to meet to discuss. You do not have to agree to meet. You don't have to be forced to go through our process. We understand that it's not for everyone. And so you're not ever forced to come speak with me. You can simply say that you're not interested, and I do respect. We understand that this avenue is not for everybody. But again, we do want to make you aware that it is an option for you. We can provide information on supportive measures, resources on and off campus, discuss, again, that informal resolution option, and explain how to file a formal complaint to initiate an investigation. So reaching out to us does not automatically trigger a formal investigation process. I do want to make everybody aware. It doesn't mean that it'll initiate in a formal process. It could just mean that we're learning what type of things that we can do to support you and help, I guess, improve your experience here at TAMU. Okay. How does reporting discrimination contribute to overall inclusion? So it is everyone's responsibility to ensure that our campus exemplifies respect for differences and fosters an environment characterized by inclusivity, understanding, and ethical behavior. Reporting incidents really helps us identify concerns and patterns and address problems. And in response, we can develop appropriate educational responses, appropriate training, appropriate ways for us to be able to address those deficiencies in the community. I always say, how can we help or stop anything from happening if we're really unaware it's happening in the first place? To us, it's non-existent because we haven't been made aware of any problems. So submitting a report helps us ensure that all members of the campus community are included and thrive in the Dust Devil experience. And ultimately, sometimes you may not realize that we have other information regarding that incident that could really help us put the piece of the puzzle together and really give us a full picture of what's going on. Okay, so these are just some tips how to be an ally. I understand that sometimes when you're a part or you witness an incident or a situation, you may not know how to respond, and that's totally okay. And that's why this educational component is here for you. So with a little preparation, we can all intervene, not only in the face of the harassment we're seeing today, but in response to other forms of racism as well. So these are just some tips to help get you, to remind you and give you ideas of how to respond whenever you see this behavior happening on campus, off campus, amongst your friends group. It's important to consider these things. So first, interrupt the conversation interaction to call attention to what was just said. Take a pause to show it's important to address. So you can, interrupt them, hang on, I want to get back to what you called the virus. Calling them out on the behavior, because sometimes people don't expect to be called out. Or unfortunately, some people don't know that what they're saying is offensive. So it's really important that we kind of call them out, stop them from continuing to make offensive comments, and really addressing that with them. The next aspect could be questioning the other person to better understand why something was just said. So you can say, why do you call it the Chinese virus? And maybe you can even have them realize that they're not really educated on the subject and they're spouting things that they don't know about, they don't know a lot about. And that moves to the next component, educating the other person about and providing facts, but explaining what was said that needs some reflection. Perhaps providing information on why we don't name a disease after its place of origin, the long history of stereotyping immigrants, or how AAPI folks are facing increasing harassment and hate. So again, educating them and making them realize that what they're saying has really a big impact, especially for what's going on right now. And then lastly, echo when others speak up too. Thank them, amplify their message, encourage continued breaks in complicit racism, share anti-racist posts and messages online, show appreciation for others in comment sections, posts, and chats. So again, we really should be, raising those people up as well who are making an effort to intervene in situations to raise awareness about the problem. There's just some things to touch on. Again, I know that it's not easy. Sometimes it's even more difficult to call out our friends and family in the situation. These are just some tips to help get you started. But again, it's not the full education that I recommend. I'll go ahead and give you some resources on this slide. So the events of 2020-2021 are not isolated and have historical context. It's an important part of being an effective ally requires us to learn more about the issues that concern us. So these are some of the things you can do, again, to be an informed ally. Again, as I mentioned before, interrupt racist behavior in your communities, including jokes, xenophobic and offensive language about the COVID-19 pandemic. Support nonprofits like Stop AAPI Hate, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and more. And I know that sometimes we think, oh, I don't have money to donate, and that's fine. Sometimes donating our time is also just as valuable. Hold your organization, friends, and family accountable to anti-racist policy and actions. Again, we should be calling out, including the people who are close to us, who are making offensive comments, who are perpetuating this disinformation. Dr. DeMello said it's really important because if we continue to allow them to say these things, we're enabling them, and they're continuing to spread that anti-Asian behavior. And then finally, getting proper training. So I know that I mentioned a few tips, but if you really want more of an in-depth training, this training is going on. It's Holla Back. We have the power to end harassment. And so I included the QR code. It is free, and it is I have it right here. It's an initiative by Holla Back and Asian Americans Advancing Justice. They partnered to organize a free bystander intervention training that provides skills for identifying and de-escalating instances of anti-Asian American harassment. So it's really for the bystander, but there's also a special training for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and how they can de-escalate a situation. So I highly recommend that training. It is free, and I think there's one coming up on the 21st, and they keep on doing free trainings for everybody. And I like how it also kind of focuses in on the anti-Asian harassment, especially since that is so prevalent today. Okay, and that's it for me. I just want to remind everybody about our Dust Devil Diversity and Inclusion website. And Dr. Milo has a feature on our Dust Devil Diversity Spotlight, and I just want to let you all know that to bring awareness to other events we have for the month of May. We have this event today and other events going on. There's really cool stuff like movie recommendations, readings, and you can also submit recommendations for things to include on the website. So for those of you who didn't know, we do have a diversity and inclusion website, and we have really cool things, and we're always updating it every month. So I highly recommend everybody to visit that website. And again, keep on visiting this page to keep abreast of any events happening for the month of May. And that's it for me. I'll go ahead and move on to the next person so we can have time for other
people. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ms. Lori. Round of applause for Ms. Lori. Up next, we have a representative from DXN. And so we're going to go ahead and have them set up, please. And I'm going to go ahead and put the attendance link. I am conscious of time, so if you do have to leave at 5:30, we understand. But if you're able to stay at least 5 more minutes after 5:30 till 5:35, we greatly appreciate it. So up next, let's go ahead and have the representative from DXN, please. Round of applause.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Alexandra. I graduated from TAMU back in May 2019, and I am also a sister of Delta Sign U. I recently just came back from spending an entire year in South Korea as an English teacher. Before I start off, South Korea is a beautiful country with great food and very rich culture. My favorite aspect of the Korean society was their fidelity to rules and uniformity. From standing in a line to wait for the subway to everyone being compliant with wearing their mask, you can really tell Korean society values rules and order. As a teacher, if any student failed to listen, their parents were immediately notified, and most of the time the next day, the students were forced to apologize to us. However, on the other hand, this homogeneous mindset also had many setbacks. Anyone who is different is seen as an outsider. So as a foreign teacher, we were often left out of very important staff meetings. We were always the last ones to know about multiple things. After a certain point, I did realize that my status as a foreigner inhibited me in the workplace. Additionally, anything that is physically different is usually stared at or judged at. Whether it be just different fashion, darker skin, different weights, many Koreans will usually just kind of stare at you, and you do feel that internal judgment. So one of my fellow coworkers, her name is Jasmine. She has been there for, I believe, almost 5 years. She did notice that something that's very consistent is that many Koreans usually follow the same trend. So one of the biggest trends I personally witnessed revolved around Starbucks. So in Korea, Starbucks, you will have these seasonal events where people need to purchase a certain amount of drinks. It's usually about 20 to 30 drinks in order to qualify for the seasonal gift. Sometimes it's like a cooler or like a little chair, but people will kind of go nuts about this. So it depends on the season, but many of my Korean friends were telling me, "Yeah, I need to be awake by 5 a.m. so I can get this gift, so I can get the goodie." And people will buy just multiple drinks, like they'll buy 20 Americanos just in order to, like I said, so they could qualify for this. But it is a bit different, but like I said, this homogeneous mindset, I would say, has its good good and bad points. But all in all, I really do recommend people to visit South Korea. It's a great experience, a great opportunity to experience a beautiful country with amazing nightlife. Thank you for listening. I will now pass this along to my sister Astrid.
Hello, hello. I cannot turn on my camera because Spectrum's being really dumb. So you're gonna have to see just a blank face. But yes, thank you, Alex. I am Astrid Veli, so I am the current president for Delta Psi Nu. And kind of like what I'm just gonna touch on is kind of like, I don't know, the call to action of everything that's been talked about today from all our presenters. So I think from all the students who've been to these social justice leadership events, they can kind of see that activism truly is something that is needed, especially in this day and age, especially right now during this pandemic. And I feel it's really necessary right now just to move to that greater good, to include everyone, to make everyone feel kind of safe and at home. And something that I feel like not a lot of students realize is that a lot of young adults and a lot of student leaders, like you all hold a lot of power in your hands. Like I don't know. As a student leader, I've kind of learned that during this pandemic. It's like a weird way of learning it. I never imagined it in an online setting. But for sure, I think there's many ways that you can help speak out for those who don't have a voice. Kind of how Ms. Lorisa had mentioned, you can really use your platforms and social media to like share articles, like good, reliable resources to help educate others because sometimes a lot of people don't even know what's happening in the world. And I think really using your voice and educating, that's some of like the starting points, even sometimes like even just coming to a social justice leadership event, that's like one initiative that you can do to become a better advocate and a better leader overall. I think also as well, even protesting, even if you want to work in the sidelines, signing petitions, even educating friends, talking about them, like, oh, have you heard about this X event that's happened or X thing? Like having those conversations, I think really is important, especially right now. Because I don't know, I imagined myself like a year ago. I didn't think of myself being so heavily involved in social justice issues like as I am now. Like, I don't know, completely different person now. And I feel a lot of student leaders can really agree on that because I think, especially with social media, it's like really in your face and you can't really just kind of turn a blind eye on it. Like, you have to help and advocate. And I think really overall, I think being an advocate is also super important because it helps you really stay up to date and kind of with the times because I uh kind of going off like how people are more wanting to be inclusive and wanting to know about pronouns and gender pronouns and not being gender conforming, it's really important, kind of like that. And if you're not up to date with that, you feel like kind of that disconnect where you're not really including everyone. And I think every day there's always a group of people that you're always supposed to be fighting for. Like right now, this month we're focusing on anti-Asian hate, but next month's gonna be something else, and the month after that will be something else. Like there's always someone to be fighting for. So I really feel, especially through activism, it helps you also become a better leader and overall helps you with critical thinking and civic engagement. So honestly, I think one of the key things I just want to end it off is that I think through activism, it helped our students and our student leaders really become better leaders, trailblazers, and overall better dust devils. So I feel overall having more advantage with the, especially like social justice leadership series, international leadership series, all these leadership programs we have in TEMU is like a good way to educate and help yourself become more informed because I think overall everyone can agree right now we need that. We need those leaders to kind of step up and help others and be that voice for those who don't. Well, those are just like my 2 cents on it. Sorry, no one could see my face. But I hope you enjoyed listening to me. I'll take it back to Miss Nayeli Lopez.
Thank you so much, Astrid. Very good. I think you provided a very good information on the impact of student leaders. And so let's go ahead and give a round of applause to all of our speakers for today, Dr. D'Mello, Ms. Larissa Cortez, Astrid Belize, the other representative. I didn't get your name from DXN, but from your experience with South Korea. Thank you so much, everybody. I did drop the survey. If you can please, it takes about 2 minutes or so to complete this survey. You can put in the comment box, what type of programs you want to see coming up. We are always looking for collaborations, just like today. We collaborate with a professor, with another administrator, with students. We're always looking for collaborations. So we will pick up the Social Justice Leadership Series in September with Latinx, Hispanic Heritage Month, etc. And so we're looking for professors, staff, and students to collaborate with us. And so please pick up your free Social Justice Leadership Series wristband in our office. And that's all I have for you all today. Thank you so much, everybody. Round of applause for everybody. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye. Have a good afternoon. All right. Thank you, Ms. Lori, and bye, Dr. D'Mello. Thank you so much.
Miss Lopez.
Bye.